I have told this story only once before, and that was to my horse, out on the east pasture on a November morning when the frost was still blue on the grass, and the sky had gone the color of a tin cup. Horses don't repeat things and they don't look at you sideways. Those were two qualities I had come to prize above most others by the time I was 53 years old, which was the age I was when Marin Colby stepped off the noon train at Cimarron Depot with a leather satchel in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. The paper was her conditions. She had written them out in advance, 6 of them. I ought to back up. My name is Callum Draft. I ran 1,100 acres of high desert cattle range in the New Mexico Territory, south of the Canadian River, in a narrow valley the old Mexicans had called Arroyo Blanco for the white caliche that banked along the creek. I had been running it alone for 11 years by then, which is to say since the autumn Clara died of the fever that took 3 other women in the valley that same season, and spared me nothing except the continuing obligation to get up in the morning and feed the cattle. I had 2 hands peso and a boy named Ike who was not really a boy anymore, but I had hired him when he was 17 and habits stick. There was the house, which was adobe and therefore cool in summer and tolerable in winter, and always the color of old bone. There was the barn, which was neither cool nor tolerable but held together. There was the range, which was mine, and the cattle, which were mine, and the debt against the east pasture fence line, which was also mine. What was not mine, and had not been for 11 years, was any particular reason to cook a proper meal or heat the far side of the bed. I am not a man given to complaint. I am setting down facts. The idea of writing to a woman about a practical arrangement came from a letter the Tucumcari County newspaper ran in the fall of 1879, which Peso read aloud to me while I was patching harness, and which I ignored until I didn't. The letter was from a schoolteacher in Cimarron, a widow of 3 years named Marin Colby, who described herself as 41, capable, in good health, and in possession of no illusions about the romantic possibilities of the New Mexico Territory. She was looking, she wrote, not for a husband in the sentimental meaning of the word, but for an arrangement with a man of steady character who needed a capable woman at the ranch and could offer a stable situation in return. She used the word arrangement 3 times in 4 sentences. I remember thinking, here is a woman who has looked at her circumstances without blinking. I put the paper down. I picked it up again. I went to bed. In the morning I wrote her a letter. I told her I had 1,100 acres, about 400 head, 2 hands, and no children, which last fact was not something I had chosen, but was simply how things had fallen. I told her I was 52 years old and had been alone 11 years, and had no expectation of changing my habits except in the ways strictly necessary for cohabitation. I told her I was not looking for sentiment. I asked if she wanted to correspond further or if she'd rather I not write again, either answer being acceptable to me. She wrote back in 9 days. The letter was 3 pages, organized into numbered points. I had not expected numbered points. Point 1 was that she had a trunk of books she intended to bring, and she would not be parted from them. Point 2 was that she would run the house as she judged best and would expect no interference in that domain. Point 3 was that she would need 1 afternoon per week that was her own, not accounted for, no questions asked. Point 4 was that she would not be spoken to as a hired hand nor treated as one. She was coming as a partner to an arrangement and expected to be addressed accordingly. Point 5 was that she considered the question of the sleeping arrangement a matter to be settled between them, once she had formed a proper opinion of him, and she expected him to feel the same. Point 6 was that she proposed a 1-year review, at which point either party could, without rancor or recrimination, determine that the arrangement was not serving them and dissolve it by mutual agreement. At the bottom she had written, "These are not demands. They are the conditions under which I believe the arrangement has a reasonable chance of working. If any of them are unacceptable to you, please say so directly, and we can part as strangers without hard feelings on either side." I read it twice. Then I got my pen and wrote at the bottom of the same sheet beneath her signature, "Conditions accepted. Callum Draft, send the trunk ahead." She came on the 14th of October, 1879, on the noon train from Cimarron. I had driven the buckboard myself. Peso had offered to come, but I told him the trip didn't require 2 men, which was true, and that I preferred to go alone, which was also true. I am not a man who performs well when observed doing something he is uncertain about. I was uncertain about this. The depot at Cimarron was a single-room affair with a painted sign that had been losing its letters since 1874. I stood on the platform in my good coat, which Clara had ordered from a catalog, and which I had not worn since her funeral, and I watched the train come in and thought, "What in the name of reason have you done, Callum?" She came off the train third. I knew her at once, though I could not have said how, since the letter had contained no description and I had not thought to ask for one. She was of medium height, neither slight nor broad, wearing a dark wool traveling coat and a hat that had seen better years but was pinned exactly right. She carried the leather satchel in her right hand. She was looking at the platform with the careful attention of a woman cataloging exits, and when her eyes came to me, she held them there for a moment and then walked directly toward me without hesitation, which I noted. "Mr. Draft," she said, "it was not a question." "Mrs. Colby," I said, "it was also not a question." We shook hands. Her grip was brief and entirely dry. "The trunk is in the luggage car," she said, "second from the left." "I'll see to it." "Thank you." That was the full extent of our first conversation. I got the trunk. It was heavy, which meant the books were real, and loaded it in the buckboard, and she climbed up without assistance, which I had half expected, and we drove the 18 miles to Arroyo Blanco with the late October sun dropping toward the mesas and the scrub oak along the creek going the color of old copper. She looked at the country. She did not make conversation, and neither did I, which suited me down to the ground. At the ranch she looked at the house with a thorough, unhurried eye. "Adobe," she said. "Yes." "Good in summer." "Yes." "The kitchen faces east." "Yes." "That's good too." She went inside. I brought in the trunk. When I came back through the front room she was already in the kitchen, reading the state of the stove with her hands, and eyes the way a doctor reads a patient, and she had taken off her hat and hung it on the peg by the back door as if she had lived there for years. "The chimney draws well?" she asked. "Never had a problem." "The well?" "Good, deep, doesn't go dry even in August." She opened the larder door, looked in, closed it without comment, and turned to face me. "Mr. Draft," she said, "I think we have both agreed to something unusual, and I want to say one thing about it plainly, if you'll allow me." "Go ahead." "I am not here under any illusion. I know what this is and what it isn't. I will do my best by this arrangement, and I expect you'll do the same. That's all I ask. That's all I'm offering." I looked at her. She was looking directly back at me, steady as a post. "That's all I'm asking too," I said. She gave a short nod. "Then we understand each other." "I believe we do." Peso and Ike ate supper at the house that first night, which was the custom. Marin served beans and cornbread, and a pan of dried apple she had found somewhere in the back of the larder and reconstituted into something that passed for a dessert. She did not join us at the table in the sense of sitting and eating. She ate standing at the stove, working on tomorrow's bread while she had the heat. She listened to the conversation without entering it, and when Peso made a clumsy joke about a bachelor finally getting fed properly, she looked at him with an expression of mild, patient attention and said nothing, which managed to be more effective than any response she could have made. Peso did not make another clumsy joke. After supper she washed the dishes and I dried, which was not a thing I had done since Clara died, and neither of us spoke. It was comfortable, was the unexpected thing. Not the silence of two strangers not knowing what to say, but the silence of two people who have each decided that words cost something and ought to be spent accordingly. October passed and November came on cold, the way it always does in the valley, with a wind off the sangers that cuts through coats and finds the gaps in adobe walls and makes a man remember why his ancestors built fires. We had been living in the same house for 6 weeks by then, and I had formed a clear picture of Maren Colby. She was precise. Not fussy, there is a difference, but precise. The bread was the same every time. The accounts she had taken over from the leather-bound book I kept in the desk were suddenly legible and organized in a way that made me mildly embarrassed about 11 years of my own bookkeeping. She rose before I did each morning, which was a feat, since I rose before 4 and the coffee was always ready. She asked questions directly when she needed information, and did not ask them when she did not. She took her one free afternoon on Thursdays. She rode the mare Peso called Kalichi out along the South Ridge, and I did not ask where she went, as agreed. She was also, I began to notice, funny in a dry way she did not advertise. Ike, who was 23 and inclined toward the dramatic, came in one October evening convinced he had seen a mountain lion on the west fence, and told the story at such length that Peso fell half asleep in his chair. Maren listened to the whole account and then said, very quietly, that it was possible he had seen a mountain lion, but she had also heard that the Hendersons' orange cat had gotten loose again and was known to take the fence line. Ike stared at her. Then he laughed, which was all she had wanted, and the tension went out of the room. I noticed things like that. I told myself it was because I was a man accustomed to running a ranch, which required attention to everything that moved through it, and that noticing Maren was no different from noticing a change in the weather. On the 4th of November, I lit a candle in the far bedroom, which was the room I used as a study, and I sat with it until it burned out. It was Clara's birthday. I had done this every year since she died, not from sentiment exactly, but from something more like obligation to the truth of what she had been, and the fact that she had existed. I did not make a ceremony of it. I simply sat in the dark with the candle and let the evening pass. Maren saw the light under the door. I know because in the morning there was a small bunch of dried chamomile on the study windowsill, cut from the bundle she kept in the kitchen. She had put it there some time in the night. She said nothing about it. I said nothing about it. But I looked at those dried flowers for a long time before I went out to the barn, and I felt something shift in my chest in a way I did not immediately have a name for. The days shortened. We moved through the house like two people who had learned each other's rhythms without negotiating them. She stepped left when I stepped right at the kitchen threshold. I moved the milk jug to the shelf she could reach without comment. She left the study lamp trimmed and ready the evening she thought I would be working late, which she seemed to know before I did. These were small things, but small things in a house in winter are the walls. One evening in late November I came in from a hard day on the east fence, 2 sections down and the ground frozen solid, and she had a pot of something on the stove that smelled like the kind of thing a man needs after a day like that, and she took one look at my hands and said, "Sit," and I sat, which was not something I did easily or often at anyone's direction. She put a bowl in front of me and a piece of bread and a cup of coffee so hot it steamed, and then she went back to the books at the table. After a while I said, "Mrs. Colby." "This is good." She looked up briefly. "The beans are yours, I just added the chili." "All the same." She went back to the books, but I thought I saw the corner of her mouth change by a fraction. December arrived, and with it the question of Christmas, which I had not celebrated in any organized way since Clara's last one, and which Maren approached the way she approached most things, directly and with a plan. "I'd like to invite Peso and Ike for Christmas supper," she said one morning, "and the Areola family from the south section, if you're not opposed." "I'm not opposed." Do you observe Christmas in any particular way? I thought about it. Clara used to read the gospel, I said. We had candles. A beat, I can do that, she said, if you'd like. If you would, I said, it's your house too. She looked at me then, briefly, with an expression I had not seen before and could not entirely read. It lasted only a moment. Then she went back to her bread. Christmas came and was, by any measure, the most populated my house had been in 11 years. The Areola family brought their 3 children and a pan of tamales and a great deal of noise, and Peso and Ike brought a bottle of something that smelled aggressive and was consumed in modest quantities. Marin had made a roast from the beef I slaughtered, and a pudding from a recipe I did not know she had, and candles on the table, good candles, not the working kind, and she read the gospel after supper in a clear voice without drama or performance, just the words laid out clean, and the Areola children sat still the whole time, which was more than their parents usually managed. When everyone had gone and the house was quiet again, I was putting the good chairs back against the wall and she was doing the dishes, and she said, without turning, "Your wife must have made this feel important. I could feel it in the room." I set a chair down. "She did," I said. "You held it well." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and went and picked up another chair, and she went on with the dishes, and that was all. But I stood there holding that second chair for a moment longer than I needed to, and I thought about the woman at the sink and what she had seen, and I thought that Clara would have liked her, which was not a thought I had expected to have and which, once had, could not be unfelt. January in the Valley is the month that separates the men who belong from the men who don't. The cold comes off the mountains with a seriousness that the fall cold only hints at. The cattle bunch at the feed station and steam in the mornings, and you can see your breath from the time you get up until the sun gets itself established around 9, which it sometimes doesn't manage until 10. The pipes want watching. The barn door hasp freezes and has to be coaxed with hot water every morning. Ike got sick in the first week of January, a fever that kept him in the bunkhouse 3 days, and Peso and I worked his share between us, which meant I was in the saddle 12 hours some days, and came in at night with less capacity for human speech than usual, which was saying something. Marin handled Ike's fever with a competence that was, I realized, the result of having nursed her husband through his last illness. She did not say this. I inferred it from the matter-of-fact steadiness with which she managed the business of a sick man in close quarters, the broth, the compresses, the checking of temperature with a hand to the forehead, and a look that measured and catalogued and decided. She was not sentimental about it and not cold about it. She was simply effective, in the way that a good tool is effective. It does the work without requiring anything of you. Ike, who was 23 and inclined to be embarrassed by being tended, told me afterward that she had been awful decent about the whole thing, which from Ike was a considerable tribute. One night in mid-January I came in very late. There had been a fence breach on the north section and 2 steers in the creek and the whole miserable business of getting them out in the dark. And the house was quiet, which meant Marin had gone to bed, which was entirely reasonable since it was past 11. But on the stove there was a covered pot, and under the pot a folded piece of paper that said, in her small, exact hand, "Warm for 15 minutes. There's bread in the cloth on the counter." I stood there looking at that piece of paper for a moment. Then I put the pot on the burner and got the bread. I have tried since to explain what it was about that piece of paper that mattered. It was not a romantic thing. It was purely practical. A woman who had made supper and knew a man might come in late and left provision for it. I had fed myself alone for 11 years. I was perfectly capable of doing it. But there was the paper in her hand, with the information arranged in exactly the order I would need it, and the bread in the cloth because she knew I wouldn't think to cover it myself. And I sat at the table in the lamplight and ate, and I was aware of a warmth that had nothing to do with the food or the stove, and I did not look at it directly. The way you don't look directly at something that might not hold if you examine it too closely. I began, around this time, to refer to her as Marin. Not in address, I still said Mrs. Colby when I spoke to her directly, as she still said Mr. Draft, but in my own head. In the way I catalogued the ranch, Peso is in the south pasture, Ike is in the bunkhouse, Marin is in the kitchen. It was simply more efficient. That was what I told myself. February brought a spell of mild weather that February always brings to the high desert. 3 or 4 days of warm sun that tricks everything alive into thinking it's over. And then the cold comes back with a personal grievance about the optimism it finds when it returns. In those mild days, Marin began a kitchen garden against the south wall of the house, clearing the caliche soil with a pick, and a stubbornness that I watched from across the yard with something I am prepared to call admiration. I went over on the third afternoon with a spade. "The caliche's deep on the left side," I said. 3-4 inches. You'll want to break through it before you try to work the soil underneath. She looked at me, then at the spade. "I know what caliche is," she said, but she stepped aside. I broke through the hardpan on the left side and loosened it, and she worked in behind me with the smaller tool, and we worked for an hour in the warm February sun without talking except to point at things here, and over there, and that rock. And at the end of it, the garden bed was laid out in a rough rectangle, and we stood back and looked at it. And she said, "The students at Cimarron School thought I was a hard woman." I looked at her. She was looking at the garden. "Were you?" I asked. "I had standards," she said. "Some people call that hard." "And the rest of the time?" She picked up her smaller tool and began raking the loosened soil. "I don't know that there was a rest of the time," she said. "Teaching doesn't leave much of one." "Is that why you left it?" "Partly." A pause. "After my husband died, there was a period when I thought I would simply go on teaching until I couldn't, and then live on what I'd saved, and that would be enough." Another pause, longer. "It turned out it was enough in every practical way, but I found at some point that I was tired of coming home to a quiet house." I said nothing. "That's probably not a surprising observation," she added, with a dryness that was her version of acknowledging she'd said something personal. "It's not surprising," I said. "I've had the same problem." She looked at me then briefly. Then she went back to the raking. But something between us had shifted, the way the air shifts before a storm, not the storm itself, just the feeling that the air is taking note of something. March. 2 things happened in March that I have turned over in my mind many times since. The first was a Sunday afternoon when Marin was at the table with her books. She was a reader of serious intent, not of novels but of history and natural science, and she had her own system for marking and annotating that I had examined once when she was out and found both baffling and impressive. And I came in from the barn to get a tool I'd left on the kitchen shelf, and I stopped without meaning to. She was reading with complete absorption, one hand holding the page flat, the other at her temple, her face entirely unguarded in the way a person's face is only when they believe they are alone. And I saw something I had not seen before, which was simply her, not as the woman who managed my house with precision, and managed me with good sense, and managed the accounts better than I had managed them in a decade, but as a person who existed when no one was accounting for her, who had interests of her own that went deep, and had been going deep for 41 years before she ever heard my name. I got the tool, I went back to the barn. But I was thinking about that face, the unguarded one, for the rest of the afternoon, and I found myself thinking about it again at supper, looking at her across the table while she told Ike something about the hydrological features of the valley that she'd found in one of her books, and Ike was listening with his head tilted the way a dog listens to an unfamiliar sound, and she was patient and specific, and she used words Ike could follow without condescending to him, and I thought, here is a woman who teaches because she loves knowing things and wants other people to know them too, not because she was assigned to. The second thing was the last Thursday of March, when she came back from her afternoon ride later than usual and with mud to the knee and caliche blowing hard, and I was in the yard and she pulled up and looked at me and said, "There's a section of bank down on the South Creek. About 30 yards. The winter runoff did it." "Where?" She described the location with the exactness of someone who knew land, a natural shelf, the third cottonwood past the south fence, then another 50 yards. She had taken note of the terrain and retained it. I had expected, when I married a schoolteacher from Cimarron, that she would learn the ranch slowly and from the outside. It had not occurred to me that she would learn it the way she learned everything else. "I'll go out tomorrow," I said. "I can show you the exact spot." "I know the creek." "Yes, but I've already been there, and I know where it's worst." A pause. "All right," I said, "in the morning." We rode out together the next morning, first light, and she showed me the bank and she was right about where it was worst, and we stood there in the cold morning with our breath going white, and she pointed at the erosion pattern, and said something about the way the water was cutting that showed she had been watching the creek since October and had formed theories about it. And I listened, and then we turned and rode back in the early light with the frost still on the grass and the valley pink and gold below us. I did not speak on the way back. I had nothing wrong with me that required speaking. But I rode home thinking that the word arrangement had stopped fitting some time ago, and I had been slow to notice. April and May. Spring in the valley is the work season in the way that summer is not. Summer you manage. Spring you fight, chasing calves and mending what the winter broke and rotating the cattle through pastures before the grass gets ahead of you. I was in the saddle from before first light until past supper most days, and Peso and Ike were the same, and the house ran itself, which is to say Marin ran it. She also, I discovered in April, had been corresponding with the Areola family's eldest daughter, a girl of 12 who had some aptitude for reading and not enough opportunity, and had been lending her books and receiving letters in return, and sending letters back with corrections and encouragement. She mentioned this only when I noticed a pile of books set apart on the table and asked about them, and she said it as if it were simply a thing she was doing, of no particular note. "Does the family know?" I asked. Mrs. Areola encouraged it. "And the girl?" "She's bright," Marin said, "brighter than she knows." I went back to my accounts, then I looked up and said, "That's a good thing you're doing." She was sorting the books. "It's a small thing," she said. "Small things add up." She looked at me with an expression I had come to think of as her considering look, the one where she was taking in what you'd said and deciding whether it merited a response and what the right response would be. After a moment she said, "Yes, they do." We looked at each other across the table for a moment longer than the exchange required, and then she went back to the books. May came with heat and wildflowers along the creek, orange and yellow, and the garden against the south wall went from bare dirt to something real, rows of beans and squash and chilies, and a section of herbs that she tended with the same methodical care she brought to everything. I noticed, walking past it in the evenings, that the garden smelled like something that should be there, permanent, as if it had been there before we were. One evening in late May I sat on the porch after supper, which was a thing I had stopped doing after Clara died, because the porch in the evening had been her place as much as mine, and sitting there alone felt like a statement I didn't want to make. Marin came out and sat in the other chair, and for a while we watched the light go off the mesas in its usual way, red and then gold and then the long blue. "How long has it been like this?" she said. "What way?" Quiet settled, a pause, like a place that knows what it is. I thought about it. "Since before I bought it," I said. "The valley doesn't change. I just learned to fit it." "That's not nothing," she said, "to fit a place. Took time. Most things worth fitting do." The blue deepened on the mesas. I thought about 11 years of evenings on this porch that I had not sat through because the chair next to me was empty, and I thought about the woman in that chair now, and I thought about all the things the word arrangement was not equipped to hold. "Mrs. Colby," I said. "Oh." I did not say anything else for a while. I was trying to find the right words, and I am not a man who finds words easily. "The year is almost up," I said finally. It was not what I had meant to say. It was the outer edge of what I meant. She was quiet. "October," she said. "Yes." The light was nearly gone. The first star was up over the eastern ridge. "I haven't been thinking about October," she said. I looked at her then in the blue dark. She was looking at the star. "Neither have I said. And that was all we said. But I went to bed that night feeling like a man who has been carrying something in his coat for a long time and has finally set it down in a place where it can be looked at. June and July. I want to say something about the particular quality of summer in that valley, because it has bearing on what I am trying to describe. Summer in the high desert is not gentle. The heat comes early and is complete, and the sky is the kind of blue that has no ceiling to it, and the cattle seek whatever shade there is, and the creek drops 2 feet and shows its bones, and the work doesn't stop just because the thermometer says to. But there is also in the evenings a light that I have never seen anywhere else. The sun dropping behind the Jemez Range and coming through the last of the thunderheads from the afternoon monsoon and going amber and then violet over the valley, and the air, which has been hot all day, cooling in the space of an hour to something that can only be called relief. It is the kind of evening that demands a porch. We sat on the porch most evenings in June and July. I say this as a plain fact. We developed habits the way 2 people who share a space develop habits, the order in which we came out, the chairs, the timing. She brought her book sometimes and read until the light failed. I sat with my coffee and looked at the range and thought through the next day's work and let the day settle. We talked more in those evenings than we had talked in any other season, which is to say we talked a reasonable amount, which for me was considerably more than usual. She asked questions about the ranch, real questions, the kind that assumed she would use the answers, and I asked questions about her life before, her husband, the teaching, Cimarron. She answered the way I'd learned she answered personal questions, which was without evasion but also without decoration. Her husband had been a decent man and a good one, and she had loved him and missed him, and also she had been lonely in the marriage in the way you can be lonely in a marriage when one person is fully present and the other is not unkind, but is simply, constitutionally, elsewhere. She said this without bitterness and without asking for sympathy. She was reporting the truth of a thing as she had known it. "And what made you write the letter?" I asked once. "The advertisement, I mean, not just to respond but the way you responded, the conditions." She thought about it. "I had watched women in bad situations," she said, "come to worse ones because they were not clear at the outset about what they needed and what they would not accept. I decided that if I was going to do this at all, I was going to do it plainly. Say the thing. Let the man decide whether it suited him. And if no man had?" "Then no man had," she said. "I wasn't desperate. I was clear about the difference." I thought about the woman I had expected from that letter, precise, self-contained, manageable, and the woman sitting next to me in the violet evening light, who was all of those things and also entirely more than any of them. "The conditions suited me," I said. "I know," she said. "You answered them in 9 words. Was that not enough?" "It was," she said. "It was exactly enough." I looked at my coffee, she looked at her book. We sat there in the cooling evening, and I thought about 9 words and 6 conditions and 11 years, and the way that a practical thing, tended to and lived in honestly, can become something that the word practical is not long enough to carry. August. There was a problem with the east well in August, a crack in the casing that lets sediment in, which is a serious business in dry country, and which required pulling the casing and re-cementing, and 3 days of hauling water from the creek while we waited for it to cure. The whole exercise was expensive and hot and foul-tempered, and I was not good company for those 3 days, which Marin managed by giving me useful things to do when I was of use, and leaving me alone when I was not, a distinction she had become very accurate about. On the third night, when the well was reset and we were waiting for the cement to cure through one more day, I came in and sat at the table, and she put coffee in front of me and sat down across from me, which was not her usual way. She generally let me decompress at my own pace before she came near, and she said, "Tell me what else is bothering you, because it's not the well." I looked at her. "The fence dead on the east section," I said. "How bad?" I told her. It was not the worst thing in the world, but it was not comfortable either, and it was made worse by the well repair, which had not been in my reckoning. She listened without expression, and then she got up and got the account book and sat down with it and opened it to the East Pasture page and said, "All right. Let's look at it." We sat at that table until past 10, working through the numbers, which was 2 hours longer than I generally spent on accounts at one sitting, and also the most useful 2 hours I had spent on the East Section problem in 6 months. She saw a thing I had not seen, a way of staging the fence repair across 2 seasons rather than one that cut the immediate outlay without compromising the fence integrity. And she explained it in the same way she explained things to Ike's daughter in her letters. Clearly, with patience, without making me feel like a man who had missed something obvious, even though I had. When we were done, she closed the book and I said, "You're wasted running a ranch." She looked at me straight. "I'm not wasted here," she said. "Don't say that." I held her look. "I meant it as a compliment." "I know how you meant it," she said. "I'm telling you it isn't one. This is where I chose to be. It's not a smaller thing than something else." A silence. "You're right," I said. "I'm sorry." She accepted this with a nod and took the account book back to the shelf. I sat at that table after she'd gone to bed, and I thought about a woman who had come to me with 6 conditions, and had meant all of them, including the one about being a partner and not a hired hand, and how I had said I'd accepted that condition, and how I had not quite understood what I was accepting until now. September. The light changes in September the way it always does, the angle of it going gold earlier in the day, and the evenings carrying the first real smell of autumn, the scrub oak along the creek beginning to think about turning. I have always liked September in the valley. It feels like the year taking a breath before what comes next. Marin's garden came in full in September. The beans, the squash, the chilies, all of it, more than we could use in a season, which she handled by putting up jars with an efficiency that turned the kitchen into an operation for 2 weeks, and filled the larder in a way I had not seen it filled since Clara. She gave some to the Areolas and some to Peso and Ike, and there were still jars enough to last through spring. I helped where she needed help and stayed out of the way where she didn't, which was the only reasonable approach. One evening I was moving a flat of jars from the table to the larder shelf, and I said, without thinking, "Marin." She turned from the stove. "Could you?" I pointed at the shelf I needed. "Second one down behind the flour." She moved the flour and I slid the flat in. We were standing close, the way you are in a working kitchen, and she looked at me with a considering look and said, "You've been calling me Marin for weeks." "Just now," I said. "Just now to my face," she said. "I've heard it at other times." A pause. "I don't mind." I stepped back. "All right," I said, "then I'll use it." She went back to the stove. "You can use it," she said without turning. "As long as you're prepared for me to use Callum." "That's fair," I said. "I thought so," she said. And that was all, and it was nothing, and it was not nothing at all. October. The 14th came around, a year to the day since I'd stood on the depot platform at Cimarron in Clara's coat. I was aware of it when I woke up. I don't know if Marin was. We did not say anything about it. The days went on. The scrub oak on the creek went full gold. The cattle moved to the lower pasture. The mornings turned cold and then cold serious, and the light at noon had that particular autumn slant that means the year is closing down. I went about my work and Marin went about hers, and we ate supper together and sat on the porch when the evenings were warm enough, which they were less often now, and we talked in the way we had been talking all summer, and I thought about October. I did not raise it. 2 weeks past the 14th, 3 weeks, and I did not raise it, and she did not raise it, and I was aware that we were both not raising it, and I was aware that the not raising of it was itself a kind of speaking. On a Thursday evening in late October, a cool one, we'd had the first hard frost 2 nights before, and the porch was not a reasonable proposition. I came in from the barn, and she was at the table with her books, and there was supper on the stove, and the lamp was burning. I hung my coat and took off my boots and went to the stove and poured coffee, and then I looked at the table. Her chair was on one side of the lamp. My chair was on the other. They had been in these positions since she moved them gradually over the course of the year, hers from the far end where it had started, mine from the head where I had always sat. They were equal on either side of the lamp now, the way 2 chairs at a hearth are equal, both in the light. I had done this. I had moved my chair and she had moved hers, and neither of us had said a word about it, and here they were. I looked at those 2 chairs for a moment. Then I said, Marin. She was reading the 1-year review. She looked up. I'm not raising it, I said. A pause. She looked at me steadily. I'm not raising it either, she said. All right, I said. All right, she said. I sat down in my chair. She went back to her book. I drank my coffee and looked at the lamp, equal between us, and I thought that this was what it looked like when 2 people, both of them careful and both of them once burned and both of them too old for nonsense, decide to stay. Not a speech, not a ceremony, just the chairs where they'd moved them and the lamp where it was and the supper on the stove and the year going forward. She looked up from her book after a while and said, the fence staging. We should start the planning for the spring section before December, while the numbers are in mind. Tomorrow, I said. Good. She went back to her book. I went back to my coffee. Outside, the frost was coming down again on the valley, the white caliche along the creek going silver in the moonlight, the cattle settled in the lower pasture, the garden banked and waiting for next spring. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was burning between us. I had been alone for 11 years, and I had been alone in the specific way of a man who has learned to mistake solitude for sufficiency, who has told himself the quiet is fine, who has kept his habits and his distances and his careful ledger of what he was and was not willing to need. And then a woman had come off a train with a satchel and 6 conditions, and had moved her chair toward the lamp, and had taught me, very slowly and without ever making a lesson of it, that there is a difference between a house and a home, and that the difference is not furniture or warmth or even a meal on the stove, but simply the particular weight of another person's presence. A presence you have stopped having to explain yourself to. A presence you have stopped needing to maintain a distance from. A presence that has become, without your permission or your planning, the fixed point around which the rest of the day organizes itself. I had not planned to need her. I needed her. She was reading her book in the lamplight, steady and self-contained and entirely herself, with no particular awareness that she had done this to me, or perhaps a considerable awareness and the good sense to let me arrive at it on my own. I looked at the 2 chairs, equal in the light. I thought, this is what a home looks like when you build it the slow way, with your hands and your patience and your willingness to stay when you hadn't planned to, and without a single word more than the thing required. I thought that was enough. I thought it was more than enough. I finished my coffee. She turned a page. The frost settled on the valley and the lamp burned between us, and neither of us moved to leave.